The gaslight flickered against the fog-soaked cobblestones of Whitechapel as Martha Tabram clutched her shawl tighter. August heat had given way to an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very stones beneath her worn boots. In the narrow alleyway behind George Yard buildings, shadows moved with deliberate purpose, and the scent of coal smoke mixed with something far more sinister, drifting through the London night. The penny dreadfuls had filled Victorian minds with tales of fictional horrors, melodramatic stories of ghosts and ghouls sold for mere pennies on street corners. But here, in the autumn of 1888, reality would prove far more terrifying than any serialized fiction. The whispered rumours spreading through the tenements spoke of something hunting in the darkness, something that moved between the pools of amber light cast by the street lamps like a character stepped from the pages of those lurid publications. Martha paused at the entrance to the stairwell, her breath visible in the cold air. Above, a window creaked open, then quickly shut. The city held its breath, as if sensing that the line between penny dreadful fantasy and brutal truth was about to blur forever in the winding streets of Victorian London's most notorious district. Chapter 1. When Fiction Bleeds into Reality. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time, to an age when gaslight carved uncertain circles of amber against the darkness, when the boundary between imagination and reality grew thin as parchment in the flickering shadows of Victorian London. Whether you are listening from a cosy bedroom in New York as midnight approaches, or perhaps settling in for the night in a countryside cottage as the clock strikes 10, you are welcome here in this moment of stillness. Time has a way of bending when we speak of the past, drawing us into stories that echo still through the centuries. If you find comfort in these tales of history's darker corners, do consider subscribing to the Bedside Historian. Your support helps these stories find their way to others who seek solace in the shadows of the past. Now, let us step together into the gaslit world of 1888, where the cobblestones of London held secrets that would transform the very nature of fear itself. The autumn of 1888 arrived in London like a shroud drawn slowly across the city. September brought with it an unusual chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of the ancient metropolis, creeping through the narrow alleyways of Whitechapel and Spitalfields with the persistence of a whispered prayer. The Thames moved sluggishly beneath the weight of fog so thick it transformed familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions of themselves, while the gaslight struggled against the perpetual dusk that had descended upon the East End. In the cramped tenements and lodging houses that lined the labyrinthine streets, residents huddled closer to their meagre fires and spoke in hushed tones of things that moved in the darkness. The penny press had filled their minds for decades with tales of gothic horror and supernatural dread. Serialized stories sold for mere pennies that painted pictures of vampires stalking through moonlit graveyards and phantoms haunting ancient castles. These lurid publications, printed on the cheapest paper and bound with string, had become the opium of the working classes, offering escape from the harsh realities of industrial London into worlds where evil wore the comfortable mask of the fantastic. But something was stirring in the shadows of the East End that would make those fictional horrors seem pale and insubstantial by comparison. Reality, it seemed, had grown tired of playing second fiddle to imagination. Martha Tabram had lived her 39 years in the grinding poverty that characterized the lives of thousands of women in Whitechapel. Born Martha White in the countryside of Suffolk, she had known a different life once, when fields stretched green beneath summer skies, and the air carried the scent of growing things rather than coal smoke and human desperation. But London had a way of transforming those who came to her, grinding them down like grain beneath millstones until only the essential remained. The city had taken Martha's hopes and given her survival in return. It had taken her youth and given her the hard wisdom of the streets. It had taken her innocence and given her the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of poverty with a resilience that would have impressed the heroes of those penny dreadfuls she sometimes glimpsed in shop windows. On this particular evening in late August, as the heat of the day finally began to fade into the cooler embrace of night, Martha made her way through the familiar streets with the careful steps of someone who had learned to read danger in the tilt of shadows and the quality of silence. The gaslight created pools of amber illumination at regular intervals, but between them lay territories of darkness that could hide any number of secrets. George Yard buildings loomed before her like a monument to urban decay, its brick facade stained with soot and decades of London rain. The narrow courtyard that gave the building its name had once been intended as a small oasis of light and air, but time and neglect had transformed it into something more akin to a well, with shadows pooling at its bottom and the sky visible only as a distant rectangle of lesser darkness far above. Martha paused at the entrance to the stairwell, her breath visible in the unexpectedly cool air. August nights in London were typically warm and close, the heat of the day trapped between buildings and held there by the weight of humid air. But tonight carried with it a chill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than weather, something that made her pull her threadbare shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The silence was unusual too. London was never truly quiet, especially not in the tenements where thin walls failed to contain the sounds of too many lives pressed too closely together. There should have been the murmur of voices, the crying of children, the arguments and laughter and mundane conversations that formed the soundtrack of urban poverty. Instead, there was only a peculiar hush, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Above her, a window creaked open, the sound sharp and sudden in the stillness. Martha looked up but could see nothing beyond the suggestion of movement behind grimy glass. Then, just as quickly, the window snapped shut again, leaving only the echo of its closing to disturb the heavy air. The cobblestones beneath her feet were slick with the perpetual dampness that seemed to seep from London's very foundations. They had been laid decades ago, when the city was smaller and the world moved at the pace of horses rather than the relentless rhythm of industrial machinery. Now they bore the weight of a metropolis that had grown beyond all reasonable proportion, their surfaces polished smooth by countless footsteps and wagon wheels, creating a treacherous surface that could send the unwary sliding into darkness with a single misstep. Martha had walked these streets for years, but tonight they felt different somehow, charged with a potential that made the hair on her arm stand on end despite the woolen sleeves of her dress. The familiar landmarks of her world seemed to shift subtly in the gaslight, creating the illusion that the very geography of Whitechapel was rearranging itself while no one was looking. In the distance, she could hear the muffled sounds of the city continuing its nightly business. The Thames moved restlessly against its banks, carrying the detritus of empire toward the sea. Factory whistles marked the changing of shifts with their mournful calls. Somewhere, a church bell tolled the hour with the ponderous weight of centuries behind each bronze note. But here, in this small pocket of the East End, the silence pressed against her ears like cotton wool. The penny dreadfuls that Martha sometimes saw littering the gutters had prepared the Victorian mind for horror, but only horror of a particular type. The terrors they depicted were grandiose and supernatural, dressed in the comfortable distance of Gothic castles and foreign lands. Vampires stalked through Transylvanian forests, werewolves howled beneath full moons on lonely moors, and ghosts rattled chains in the ruins of medieval abbeys. These were horrors that could be contained within the boundaries of fiction, safely experienced and then set aside when the final page was turned. But the East End of London in 1888 was discovering that true horror needed no supernatural trappings. It could walk on human legs, think with a human mind, and commit acts that no Gothic novelist would have dared to imagine, for fear that readers would find them too grotesque to believe. The real monster that was stirring in the shadows of Whitechapel would prove that human evil, unleashed from the constraints of civilization, could surpass any fictional demon in its capacity for creating terror. The social fabric of Victorian London was fraying at its edges, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the overcrowded warrens of the East End. Immigration had swollen the population far beyond what the medieval street plan could accommodate, creating a density of human habitation that would have been unimaginable to the city's founders. Irish refugees fleeing famine, Jewish families escaping persecution, rural labourers drawn by the promise of industrial employment, all had converged on London's eastern districts, creating a polyglot community bound together by shared poverty and mutual incomprehension. In this environment, traditional social structures had broken down almost entirely. The careful hierarchies that governed middle-class Victorian life meant nothing in the tenements of Dorset Street or the doss houses of Thrall Street. Here, survival trumped respectability, and the elaborate moral codes that defined proper society gave way to more fundamental concerns about food, shelter, and safety. Martha Tabram understood these realities with the clarity that came from living them daily. She had learned to navigate the complex ecosystem of the streets, where kindness and cruelty existed in close proximity, where a stranger's generosity might mean the difference between a meal and hunger, but where trust given too freely could lead to violence or worse. It was a world that demanded constant vigilance and the ability to read the subtle signs that distinguished friend from predator. As she stood in the shadow of George Yard buildings, Martha found herself thinking of the stories she had heard, whispered in the public houses and common lodging rooms over the past weeks. Tales of women who had vanished without explanation, of bodies discovered in circumstances too disturbing for the newspapers to report in full detail. The penny dreadfuls might titillate their readers with fictional gore, but the real press maintained certain standards of decency that prevented them from describing the true extent of human brutality. The fog that had plagued London throughout the summer seemed to be gathering strength as autumn approached, rolling off the Thames in thick yellowish billows that reduced visibility to mere yards and muffled sound in ways that played tricks on the ear. In such conditions, familiar streets became alien landscapes, and the ordinary citizens of the East End found themselves moving through their own neighbourhoods like explorers in an unknown country. Gas lamps struggled against the murky air, their flames creating small spheres of wan illumination that seemed to push back the darkness only reluctantly. Between these oases of light lay territories of shadow where anything might lurk undetected. The fog had a way of transforming the most mundane objects into threatening shapes. A lamppost became a lurking figure, a pile of refuse took on the contours of a crouching beast, and the play of light and shadow across building facades created the illusion of movement where none existed. Martha had grown accustomed to the fog, as all Londoners eventually did. It was as much a part of the city's character as the Thames or the Tower, an environmental constant that shaped daily life in countless small ways. But tonight the fog seemed different, charged with an electric tension that made her skin crawl and her pulse quicken without obvious cause. The architecture of the East End told the story of London's haphazard growth in brick and mortar. Ancient medieval foundations supported Georgian additions, which in turn bore Victorian improvements, creating a palimpsest of architectural styles that reflected the city's evolution from market town to imperial capital. Buildings leaned against each other for support, their timber frames warped by centuries of settling, while newer structures of industrial brick rose between them like teeth in a broken jaw. George Yard buildings represented the Victorian attempt to house the working poor with something approaching dignity. The complex had been designed with the best of intentions, providing families with private rooms and shared facilities in place of the overcrowded cellars and subdivided houses that had previously housed the destitute. But good intentions had a way of curdling in the face of economic reality, and what had been envisioned as decent accommodation for the respectable poor had gradually deteriorated into something barely distinguishable from the slums it had been meant to replace. The narrow courtyard that gave the complex its name had been intended as a source of light and air for the residents, but the surrounding buildings had grown taller over the years, blocking out most of the sky and creating a perpetual twilight at ground level. The space had become a dumping ground for refuse, and a gathering place for those whose business could not bear the scrutiny of brighter surroundings. As Martha stood at the entrance to the stairwell, she found herself remembering other nights when she had climbed these same steps, other times when the darkness had seemed less threatening and the silence less profound. The building had its own rhythm, its own personality that changed with the hours and the seasons. During the day, it bustled with the activity of families going about their daily business. Children playing in the corridors, women hanging washing from the windows, men departing for or returning from work with the measured tread of those whose lives followed predictable patterns. But night transformed the place entirely. The cheerful chaos of daytime gave way to a more subdued atmosphere, punctuated by the sounds of solitary footsteps on wooden stairs, doors closing with unnecessary force, and conversations conducted in hushed tones that suggested secrets or shame. It was during these nighttime hours that the building revealed its true nature as a repository for London's lost souls, a place where those who had fallen through the cracks of respectable society came to rest. The staircase that led to the upper floors was narrow and steep, its wooden steps worn smooth by countless feet over the decades. During the day, natural light filtered down from a grimy skylight far above, but at night the passage was illuminated only by the occasional gas fixture, creating a vertical tunnel of alternating light and shadow that seemed to stretch upward into infinity. Martha began to climb, her footsteps echoing hollowly in the confined space. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, and she found herself placing her feet more carefully to minimize the noise. There was something about the quality of the quiet that suggested it should not be disturbed, as if the building itself were sleeping and might react unpredictably to being awakened. The walls on either side were papered with layers of notices and advertisements that had accumulated over the years like geological strata. Announcements for long-past entertainments lay beneath warnings about public health measures, which in turn were covered by more recent postings advertising employment opportunities or rooms for let. The paper had yellowed and curled with age and dampness, creating a palimpsest of urban life that recorded the hopes and fears of the building's residents across multiple generations. As she reached the first landing, Martha paused to catch her breath. The air was close and stale, heavy with the accumulated sense of too many lives lived in too small a space. Cooking odours mingled with the sharper smells of carbolic soap and human habitation, while underneath it all lay the persistent dampness that seemed to permeate every building in London, rising from the clay soil beneath the city like an invisible tide. From behind one of the doors came the sound of someone weeping, a low, continuous sound that seemed to have been going on for hours or perhaps days. It was the kind of grief that had moved beyond the sharp pain of fresh loss into the dull ache of chronic sorrow, and Martha felt a familiar pang of sympathy for whoever was enduring such private agony. In the East End, tears were as common as rain, and just as unremarkable. The gaslight on the landing flickered as she passed, casting moving shadows that made the peeling wallpaper seem to writhe and shift like living things. For a moment, Martha thought she saw a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, but when she looked more directly, there was nothing there but darkness, and the suggestion of movement that might have been nothing more than the play of light through the grimy windows. She continued upward, her hand trailing along the banister for guidance in the uncertain light. The wood was smooth and slightly sticky, polished by countless other hands that had sought the same support on these treacherous stairs. Somewhere above her, a door opened and closed with the sharp sound of someone trying to move quickly while still maintaining stealth. The second landing brought her closer to her destination, but also deeper into the heart of the building's nocturnal personality. Here the silence was almost complete, broken only by the distant sounds of the city filtering through the walls like whispers from another world. The fog outside had thickened to the point where even the gaslight from the street barely penetrated the windows, leaving the interior of the building feeling detached from the surrounding city, as if it had drifted free from its moorings and was now floating in some liminal space between the real and the imagined. Martha's destination lay just ahead, but she found herself reluctant to continue. Something in the quality of the silence, the weight of the shadows, the way the very air seemed to press against her skin, suggested that this night was different from all the others that had come before. The boundary between the world of penny dreadful fiction and the harsh reality of East End life was growing thin, and she could sense that soon it might disappear entirely, unleashing horrors that would make the imagined terrors of Gothic literature seem quaint by comparison. The night held its breath, and London waited in the gathering darkness for the moment when fiction would bleed into reality, transforming the familiar streets into a landscape of nightmare that would haunt the collective imagination for generations to come. In the narrow stairwell of George Yard buildings, surrounded by the sleeping poor and the restless dead, Martha Tabram stood on the threshold of an era when the very nature of fear would be redefined by the actions of someone who moved through the gaslit shadows with purposes too terrible for any penny dreadful to contain. The hour grew later and the fog grew thicker, and somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel, a shadow began to move with deadly intent through the amber pools of gaslight, seeking prey that would soon discover that real horror needed no supernatural trappings to freeze the blood and stop the heart with terror. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of Fear. The morning of August 31st, 1888, dawned with the peculiar grey light that seemed to drain colour from even the brightest surfaces in London's East End. Martha Tabram had been discovered in the early hours, her body bearing 39 wounds upon the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings. The constables who first arrived at the scene found themselves unprepared for the methodical brutality that had been visited upon the unfortunate woman, their lanterns casting trembling shadows across the blood-stained floorboards as they attempted to comprehend what lay before them. Inspector Edmund Reed of Division stood in the narrow hallway, his notebook growing damp from the persistent fog that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice of the tenement building. The gaslight fixtures, newly installed but already showing signs of neglect, flickered with an unsteady rhythm that made the scene appear almost theatrical in its horror. The inspector had seen death before, had walked through the aftermath of violence countless times in his years patrolling the dangerous streets of Whitechapel, yet something about this particular crime struck him as distinctly different from the usual fare of domestic disputes and tavern brawls that typically claimed lives in this corner of the city. The penny dreadfuls that sold for mere coppers on every street corner had accustomed the working classes to tales of Gothic horror and melodramatic violence. Yet those serialized stories invariably concluded with justice served and evil vanquished. Here, in the suffocating reality of the tenement stairwell, no such resolution presented itself. The killer had vanished into the labyrinthine streets as thoroughly as any phantom from the pages of those lurid publications, leaving behind only questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Martha Tabram had been known to the residents of George Yard buildings, though known in the particular way that people in such places knew one another, with careful distance and practiced indifference. She had been seen in the company of soldiers from the nearby Tower of London barracks on the evening of her death, two men in uniform who had disappeared into the crowd of revellers and night workers as completely as smoke dispersed by wind. The investigators who canvassed the neighbourhood found themselves confronting the peculiar code of silence that governed life in the rookeries, where cooperation with authority was often more dangerous than the crimes themselves. The wounds upon Martha's body told a story that the police surgeon struggled to decipher. The methodical nature of the attack suggested either medical knowledge or, more disturbingly, a deliberate experimentation with the mechanics of death. Dr. Timothy Killeen, the physician who examined the remains, found himself unable to determine which of the 39 wounds had proven fatal, so thorough had been the assault. His hands, steady through years of treating the diseased and injured poor of the East End, trembled slightly as he documented each puncture and slash, each evidence of the killer's unhurried work. The residents of George Yard buildings went about their daily routines, with the forced normalcy of people accustomed to violence, yet an undercurrent of unease ran through their conversations like a fever. The women who worked the streets spoke in hushed tones of the unusual nature of the crime, comparing it unfavourably to the more familiar dangers they faced nightly. There had been robberies that turned violent, customers who became aggressive, disputes over territory or earnings that ended in blood, but this seemed different in its calculated cruelty. The penny press seized upon the story with the enthusiasm they reserved for tales that combined mystery, violence, and the exotic setting of the East End. The newspapers painted pictures of the crime scene that owed more to gothic fiction than to factual reporting, describing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, and an atmosphere of supernatural dread that hung over the narrow streets like a pall. The public consumed these accounts with the same appetite they brought to the serialized stories of crime and punishment, yet with the added frisson that came from knowing these horrors were real. Inspector Reed found himself walking the same streets night after night, retracing Martha's final hours with the methodical patience of a scholar studying ancient texts. The fog that perpetually shrouded the East End seemed to muffle sounds and distort distances, creating an environment where the familiar became strange and the ordinary took on sinister implications. He interviewed the residents of neighbouring buildings, the publicans who had served Martha her final drinks, the soldiers who had been seen in her company, yet each conversation yielded more questions than answers. The police surgeon's report, when it finally arrived at Scotland Yard, painted a picture that disturbed even experienced investigators. The wounds showed evidence of two different weapons, one consistent with a bayonet, the other with an ordinary penknife. This suggested either multiple attackers working in coordination, or a single individual who had come prepared with specific tools for his work. The implications of such premeditation sent ripples of concern through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police, who recognised that they might be dealing with an entirely new category of criminal. The autumn nights grew longer as September approached, and with them came an increase in the nervous energy that seemed to permeate the streets of Whitechapel. The gas lamps, when they functioned at all, cast pools of uncertain light that served more to emphasise the darkness beyond their reach than to provide genuine illumination. Women who had previously walked alone began travelling in groups, while those whose circumstances forced them to venture out unaccompanied did so with weapons concealed in their clothing and prayers upon their lips. The penny dreadfuls began to reflect the changing mood of their readership, with new serialized stories featuring killers who stalked the foggy streets of fictional cities that bore a distinct resemblance to London's East End. These publications had always traded in sensational violence, but now their fictional horrors seemed pale compared to the very real terror that had taken root in the narrow alleys and crowded tenements. The line between entertainment and reality blurred as readers found themselves looking over their shoulders while walking the same streets where Martha Tabram had met her end. Dr. Killeen's private notes, never intended for publication, revealed the depth of his unease with the case. The precision of certain wounds suggested anatomical knowledge, while others appeared to have been inflicted in a frenzy of violence that spoke to profound psychological disturbance. The combination troubled him in ways he found difficult to articulate, as if he were witnessing the collision of cold calculation with savage passion in a single criminal act. The investigation continued through the shortening days of late summer, with Inspector Reed's team methodically interviewing every resident of the surrounding area, every patron of the nearby public houses, every woman who worked the streets in the vicinity of George Yard buildings. The picture that emerged was of a community that lived in constant awareness of danger, yet one that had been unprepared for the particular form of horror that had visited them on that August night. The soldiers who had been seen with Martha remained elusive despite intensive efforts to locate them. The barracks at the Tower of London housed hundreds of men, and the practice of soldiers seeking entertainment in the nearby public houses and lodging houses was so common as to be unremarkable. Yet the systematic search through the ranks yielded no clear suspects, no men whose absence could be definitively placed at the time of the crime, no evidence that the military connection was anything more than coincidence. As the investigation stretched into its third week, a sense of frustration began to permeate the ranks of the investigators. The methods that had proven effective in solving other crimes seemed inadequate when confronted with an act of violence that followed no familiar pattern. The killer had left no obvious clues, no witnesses who could provide reliable descriptions, no clear motive that might lead to his identification. He had appeared from the fog-shrouded streets, committed his methodical act of violence, and vanished back into the darkness as completely as if he had never existed. The residents of Whitechapel began to speak of the crime in terms that borrowed heavily from the supernatural tales that filled the penny dreadfuls. Some whispered of an evil that had taken physical form, stalking the narrow streets in search of victims. Others spoke of a madman whose knowledge of anatomy suggested connections to the medical profession, though no evidence had emerged to support such theories. The speculation grew more elaborate with each retelling, until the simple fact of Martha Tabram's death became wrapped in layers of myth and superstition that obscured rather than illuminated the truth. The fog continued to roll in from the Thames each evening, transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes where sound carried strangely, and shadows seemed to move independently of the objects that cast them. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, the people of the East End went about their lives with heightened awareness, each unusual sound or unexpected movement serving as a reminder that something had changed in their world, that the comfortable predictability of familiar dangers had been replaced by something far more unsettling. Inspector Reed continued his nightly walks through the scene of the crime, hoping that some overlooked detail might reveal itself in the changing light, that some pattern might emerge from the seeming randomness of the violence. The investigation had become as much about understanding the nature of the crime as about identifying its perpetrator, a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex rather than clearer with each passing day. The autumn air carried the scent of coal smoke and decay, mixing with the ever-present fog to create an atmosphere that seemed to reflect the moral ambiguity of the case itself, where certainty dissolved into shadow and truth remained as elusive as the killer who had started it all. Chapter 3. The Anatomy of Fear. The morning of August the 31st, 1888, dawned grey and oppressive over the sprawling maze of Whitechapel's tenements. Fog clung to the narrow streets like a burial shroud, muffling the sounds of cartwheels against cobblestone and the distant cries of street vendors hawking their wares. In the cramped quarters above the shops and taverns, families stirred reluctantly from their restless sleep, children whimpering from hunger while mothers counted the few coins remaining from yesterday's labour. Martha Tabram's body had been discovered in the early hours, sprawled across the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings like a broken doll cast aside by an angry child. The constable who found her had required 3 attempts before his trembling hands could steady enough to light his bullseye lantern, the wavering beam revealing wounds that defied comprehension. 39 separate puncture marks decorated her torso, each one precise and deliberate, as if someone had used her flesh as a canvas for their darkest imaginings. Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen arrived as the morning light began to penetrate the gloom of the stairwell. A man of considerable experience in the examination of violent death, having served as divisional surgeon for the Metropolitan Police across some of London's most troubled districts, Killeen approached his grim task with a methodical precision that had earned him respect among his colleagues. Yet even his practiced demeanour wavered as he knelt beside Martha's cooling form, his medical bag clicking open with unusual hesitancy. The wounds told a story that challenged everything Killeen understood about human violence. Most appeared to have been inflicted with an ordinary penknife, the sort carried by dock workers and street vendors throughout the East End. But one wound, a deep gash that had penetrated her sternum, bore the distinctive marks of a bayonet or similar military blade. The precision troubled him more than the savagery. This was not the frenzied attack of a husband driven mad by gin, nor the desperate struggle of a robbery gone wrong. Someone had taken considerable time with Martha Tabram, working with the patience of a craftsman perfecting his trade. Word of the discovery spread through Whitechapel's labyrinthine streets with the swiftness of plague. In the common lodging houses where the desperately poor counted out pennies for a night's shelter, whispered conversations ceased abruptly when strangers entered. The women who walked the streets after dark, selling the only commodity they possessed to survive another day, began travelling in pairs, their eyes constantly searching the shadows that had once offered concealment and now promised only terror. Inspector Edmund Reed of H Division found himself confronting a mystery that seemed to mock the very foundations of criminal investigation. A career policeman who had earned his reputation pursuing the skilled criminals of London's underworld, Reed possessed an intimate knowledge of Whitechapel's hidden geography. He knew which public houses sheltered the receivers of stolen goods, which narrow passages provided escape routes for pickpockets, and which boarding houses asked no questions of their nocturnal visitors. Yet Martha Tabram's murder presented him with something entirely unprecedented in his 2 decades of service. The residents of George Yard buildings proved reluctant witnesses at best. Mrs. Elizabeth Mahoney, who occupied rooms on the 3rd floor, admitted to hearing footsteps on the stairs sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning. The sound had been heavy, deliberate, ascending slowly as if someone carried a considerable burden. But such noises were commonplace in a building that housed dozens of families in conditions that would have shocked the comfortable residents of Belgravia. Mrs. Mahoney had turned over in her narrow bed and returned to sleep, another lesson in the survival skills that poverty taught its most dedicated students. Alfred George Crowe, a cab driver returning home after a long night's work, had passed through George Yard at approximately 3:30 in the morning. He recalled seeing what appeared to be a bundle of old clothing on the landing, but such sights were unremarkable in a district where the homeless often sought shelter in doorways and stairwells. The distinction between a sleeping vagrant and a murder victim was not one that occurred to a tired man eager to reach his own bed. The investigation revealed disturbing gaps in the final hours of Martha's life. She had been seen drinking in the Frying Pan public house on Thrall Street, accompanied by another woman of her profession, and 2 soldiers on leave from the Tower Hamlets. The soldiers, members of the Coldstream Guards, were eventually located and questioned extensively. Their account placed them in Martha's company until approximately 11:45, at which point they claimed to have parted ways near the 10 Bells Tavern on Commercial Street. Private John Leary and Private John Law, for such were their names, presented themselves as reluctant participants in what they described as a chance encounter with 2 women seeking companionship for the evening. Their military bearing and practiced responses suggested men accustomed to official scrutiny, yet certain inconsistencies in their testimonies troubled Inspector Reed. Both men possessed bayonets as part of their standard equipment, and both had been granted late passes that would have allowed them to remain out until the early hours of the morning. The examination of their weapons proved inconclusive. Military bayonets were cleaned and maintained according to strict regulations, and any evidence that might have connected them to Martha's wounds had long since been scrubbed away by zealous adherence to army protocol. Furthermore, dozens of soldiers frequented the public houses of Whitechapel on any given evening, their presence so commonplace that witnesses struggled to distinguish one uniform from another in their recollections. As Reed delved deeper into Martha's final movements, a portrait emerged of a woman trapped in the grinding machinery of Victorian poverty. Born Martha White, in the village of Suffolk some 39 years earlier, she had married Henry Samuel Tabram, a foreman at a furniture warehouse, in a ceremony that promised respectability and modest comfort. For a time that promise had been fulfilled. The couple had maintained a household in East Greenwich, complete with 2 young sons and the trappings of lower middle-class respectability. But respectability proved fragile when confronted with Henry's increasing dependence on drink. The furniture business that had once provided steady employment began to suffer from his absences and unreliability. Creditors appeared at their door with increasing frequency, their polite inquiries gradually giving way to threats and ultimatums. Martha had attempted to supplement the household income by taking in sewing, her fingers working late into the night by the light of a single candle as she struggled to complete piecework for the clothing manufacturers of Whitechapel. The dissolution of her marriage had been gradual but inexorable. Henry's drinking transformed from an occasional indulgence into a daily necessity, consuming not only his wages, but also the small savings Martha had accumulated through her needlework. Their sons, witnesses to increasingly violent arguments between their parents, began to display the hollow-eyed wariness of children forced to mature beyond their years. When Henry finally abandoned his family entirely, disappearing into the anonymous crowds of London's East End, Martha found herself facing destitution with 2 mouths to feed and no marketable skills beyond her ability with needle and thread. The workhouse loomed as the most likely destination for women in Martha's circumstances. These grim institutions, designed according to the principle that poverty should be made as unpleasant as possible to discourage dependence, separated families and subjected their inmates to conditions that differed little from imprisonment. Martha had visited the Whitechapel workhouse on several occasions, standing in the queue of desperate souls seeking admission, while her sons clung to her ragged skirts. Each time she had ultimately turned away, unable to accept the surrender of dignity that admission would have required. Instead, she had chosen the precarious independence of the lodging house and the street corner. The common lodging houses of Whitechapel charged 4pence for a bed in a dormitory, shared with dozens of other women, or 6pence for the luxury of a small private room barely large enough for a narrow cot and a washstand. To earn these meagre sums, Martha had joined the army of women who sold themselves in the shadows of London's most desperate quarter. The trade was dangerous even under the best of circumstances. The women who worked the streets of Whitechapel faced constant threats from violent customers, predatory criminals who targeted them for robbery, and police constables who viewed them as criminals rather than victims. Yet for women without family connections or marketable skills, it represented the only alternative to the workhouse or starvation. Martha had learned to navigate this treacherous world with the cunning of a survivor, developing relationships with other women who could offer protection and advice, identifying customers who were likely to pay without violence, and avoiding the darker corners where even the desperately poor feared to venture. Her relationship with Henry Turner, a carpenter who shared her bed in various lodging houses throughout Whitechapel, had provided some measure of stability in an otherwise chaotic existence. Turner, himself a victim of the economic uncertainties that plagued London's working class, offered companionship and occasional financial support in exchange for domestic arrangements that resembled marriage in all but legal formality. Their partnership had endured for several years, weathering the storms of poverty and unemployment that destroyed less resilient unions. But even this modest security had recently begun to crumble. Turner's work had become increasingly irregular as older craftsmen found themselves competing with younger men willing to accept lower wages. Their arguments had grown more frequent and more bitter, often centering on Martha's continued involvement in street work despite Turner's objections. He had demanded that she abandon the trade entirely, promising to support her through his carpentry earnings alone. Martha, with hard-won knowledge of how quickly such promises could vanish with the next economic downturn, had refused to surrender her independence entirely. The final quarrel between Martha and Turner had occurred just 3 days before her murder. Witnesses at their lodging house reported raised voices and the sound of furniture being overturned as the couple engaged in their most violent dispute yet. Turner had stormed out, declaring his intention never to return, leaving Martha to face the approaching rent day with only a few shillings to her name. It was this financial desperation that had driven her to seek customers on the night of August 30th, despite the growing sense of unease that had begun to permeate the streets of Whitechapel. As Inspector Reed assembled these fragments of Martha's final weeks, he began to recognise patterns that would become all too familiar in the months ahead. the isolation of women cut off from family and community support, the economic pressures that drove them to accept increasingly dangerous situations, and the invisibility that made them perfect victims for someone with murder in his heart. Martha Tabram had been selected not because of any personal connection to her killer, but because she represented everything that Victorian society preferred to ignore about the consequences of its moral and economic arrangements. The investigation continued through the sweltering days of early September, but leads proved as elusive as morning mist. The soldiers' alibis, while imperfect, could not be definitively contradicted. The residents of George Yard buildings maintained their silence, either through genuine ignorance or the practiced discretion of people who had learned that cooperation with authority rarely improved their circumstances. Inspector Reed found himself confronting the possibility that Martha Tabram's killer might never be identified, that her murder might join the growing collection of unsolved crimes that haunted the files of H Division. Yet even as the official investigation began to lose momentum, whispered rumours continued to circulate through the narrow streets and crowded public houses of Whitechapel. Something had changed in the character of the district, a subtle alteration in the rhythm of daily life that defied precise description but affected everyone who called these streets home. The murder of Martha Tabram had introduced an element of calculated terror that transformed familiar surroundings into landscapes of potential menace, where every shadow might conceal a watching figure and every footstep might herald approaching doom. Chapter 4. The Streets That Whispered Death. The autumn of 1888 settled over London like a shroud, bringing with it an atmosphere thick with industrial smoke and something far more sinister. The penny dreadfuls that lined the newsstand spoke of fictional terrors, but in the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, a very real nightmare was beginning to unfold. The cobblestones, slick with perpetual dampness from the Thames, seemed to absorb the footsteps of those who walk them, as if the very stones were hungry for the stories they would soon witness. Martha Tabram had walked these streets for years, her worn boots familiar with every uneven stone and treacherous puddle. The lodging houses that lined the thoroughfares stood like sentinels in the gaslight, their windows dark or glowing with the faint amber light of oil lamps. The scent of coal smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with the less pleasant odours that rose from the overcrowded tenements where families lived packed together like cargo in a ship's hold. The district had earned its reputation through decades of poverty and desperation. Whitechapel was a place where the grand ambitions of the British Empire seemed to dissolve into shadow, where the prosperity that adorned the West End of London existed only as a distant rumour. Here, the streets were narrow and winding, designed in centuries past when London was a smaller city, now pressed into service for a population that had swelled beyond all reasonable capacity. The workhouses stood as monuments to Victorian social policy, their brick facades rising like fortress walls against the tide of destitution that seemed to flow endlessly through the district. Within their walls, the poor laboured under conditions that would have been familiar to their medieval ancestors, picking oakum or breaking stones for a meagre portion of bread and gruel. The philosophy of the age demanded that poverty be punished rather than alleviated, that the workhouse be made so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek its shelter. Martha herself embodied the harsh realities of this philosophy. She had known better days, as had many of the women who now walk these streets in the hours when respectable London slept. The economic forces that had driven them to Whitechapel were as relentless as the tide, and just as indifferent to individual suffering. The industrial revolution that had made Britain the workshop of the world had also created vast populations of displaced workers, people whose skills had been made obsolete by machinery, whose rural homes had been abandoned in search of work that proved more elusive than promised. The lodging houses where Martha and countless others sought nightly shelter represented the bottom rung of London's accommodation ladder. For fourpence, one could secure a bed in a common dormitory. For less, there was standing room in a kitchen where one might doze upright against a wall. Those without even these meagre funds faced the choice between the workhouse and the streets, both options fraught with their own particular dangers and degradations. On this particular evening in August, as the summer heat began to give way to the cooler air that would herald autumn's approach, Martha made her way through the familiar maze of streets and alleyways. The gaslight created pools of illumination that seemed to float in the darkness, leaving vast stretches of shadow between them where anything might lurk unseen. The light itself was a recent innovation, part of the great municipal improvements that had transformed London over the past generation. Yet in Whitechapel, it seemed to serve only to make the darkness more profound by comparison. The penny dreadfuls that were sold from street corners and in shop windows told tales of supernatural terror, of vampires and werewolves, of haunted castles and cursed treasures. These publications, printed on the cheapest paper and sold for the price that gave them their name, fed the Victorian appetite for sensation and horror. They were the entertainment of the working classes, stories that could be read by lamplight or gaslight, passed from hand to hand until they fell apart from use. Yet the real horror that was beginning to manifest in the streets of Whitechapel would prove to eclipse any fictional terror that the penny dreadful authors had ever conceived. The boundaries between imagination and reality were about to blur in ways that would transform not just the district, but the entire city's understanding of the darkness that could lurk in the human heart. The social reformers of the age had spent decades documenting the conditions in districts like Whitechapel, producing reports and surveys that laid bare the statistics of poverty and desperation. They wrote of overcrowding so severe that entire families lived in single rooms, of sanitation so poor that disease spread with devastating regularity, of unemployment so widespread that honest work became almost impossible to find. Yet their clinical language could not capture the lived reality of places like George Yard buildings, where Martha now made her way through the gathering darkness. The building itself stood as a testament to the hasty construction that had characterized London's response to its growing population. Erected with more concern for profit than for the welfare of its inhabitants, it housed dozens of souls in conditions that would have shocked their rural ancestors. The staircases were narrow and steep, the walls thin enough that every argument, every cough, every moment of private despair became public knowledge. As Martha climbed the worn wooden steps, the building around her settled into the quiet rhythms of night. Somewhere above, a child cried briefly before being hushed. From behind a thin door came the sound of quiet conversation, the words indistinct but the tones speaking of weariness and worry. These were the sounds of a community held together by shared hardship, people who had learned to find what comfort they could in the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggles. The newspapers that served the respectable classes of London rarely ventured into detailed coverage of life in districts like Whitechapel. When they did acknowledge such places, it was usually in the context of moral crusades or calls for reform, treating the inhabitants more as statistics than as individuals with their own stories of loss and hope. The penny press that served the working classes told different stories, focusing on sensation and scandal, on crime and punishment. But even these publications struggled to capture the quiet desperation that characterized daily life in the East End. The economic forces that had created these conditions were as complex as they were pitiless. The great trading companies that had made London the financial capital of the world operated according to principles that bore little relation to the needs of people like Martha. The docks that stretched along the Thames employed thousands, but the work was irregular and poorly paid, subject to the vagaries of weather and international commerce. The factories that had sprung up throughout the East End offered employment, but at wages that barely allowed for survival, and under conditions that took a terrible toll on health and spirit. The religious institutions that had traditionally provided some measure of support for the poor found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of need in districts like Whitechapel. The established church, with its comfortable parishes in more prosperous areas, seemed increasingly irrelevant to those who struggled daily for survival. The newer evangelical movements that had emerged during the century tried to address the spiritual needs of the poor, but their resources were limited, and their message of patience and resignation often seemed inadequate to the immediate realities of hunger and homelessness. Into this world of grinding poverty and institutional indifference, something was about to emerge that would capture the attention of all London. The crimes that would soon begin would be remarkable not just for their brutality, but for the way they would force the comfortable classes to acknowledge the existence of the East End and its inhabitants. The penny dreadfuls had prepared the public imagination for tales of horror, but the reality that was about to unfold would prove more disturbing than any fiction. The fog that rolled in from the Thames on late summer evenings created an atmosphere that seemed designed for mystery and concealment. It softened the harsh edges of the industrial landscape, but it also created pockets of invisibility where anything might happen unseen. The gas lamps that were meant to provide security and illumination became isolated islands of light in an ocean of grey obscurity. As Martha reached the landing outside her lodging, the building around her had settled into the uneasy quiet that characterized the hours before dawn. This was the time when the day shift workers were still sleeping and the night shift had not yet returned, when the streets below were largely empty except for those whose business was conducted in shadow. It was during these hours that the boundary between the respectable world and the underworld became most permeable, when the normal rules of society seemed suspended in the grey space between night and day. The events that would soon transform Martha from an anonymous resident of George Yard buildings into a name known throughout the British Empire were still hours away. For now, she remained simply another inhabitant of London's vast underclass, her individual story lost in the larger narrative of urban poverty and social displacement that characterized the age. The morning would bring discoveries that would echo through the penny dreadfuls and the respectable press alike, marking the beginning of a reign of terror that would come to define not just Whitechapel, but the entire Victorian conception of urban horror. The line between fiction and reality was about to be crossed in ways that would haunt the collective memory long after the gaslight had been replaced by electric illumination and the cobblestones had given way to modern pavement. Chapter 5. The Anatomy of Fear. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of George Yard as the first pale light crept between the sooty brick buildings. Inspector Frederick George Aberline pulled his coat tighter against the September chill, his breath forming small clouds in the damp air as he approached the narrow stairwell where Martha Tabram's body had been discovered. The metallic scent of blood still lingered despite the hours that had passed since the constable's whistle had pierced the pre-dawn silence. Aberline had seen death in many forms during his years with the Metropolitan Police, yet something about this scene struck him with an unusual sense of foreboding. The 39 wounds that marked Martha's body spoke of a violence that seemed almost ritualistic in its thoroughness. Each puncture had been deliberate, methodical, as if the killer had taken perverse pleasure in the act itself rather than simply the result. The tenement buildings of George Yard rose like weathered monuments to poverty around him. Laundry lines stretched between windows, heavy with garments that would never quite dry in the perpetual dampness of London's East End. Children's voices echoed from the upper floors, their laughter creating an unsettling contrast to the grim scene below. This was a place where life and death existed in uncomfortable proximity, where the struggle for survival had hardened hearts against the misfortunes of neighbours. Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen had completed his examination of the body in the early hours, his medical bag clicking shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the narrow courtyard. The wounds, he had reported to Aberline, were consistent with a bayonet or similar military blade for most of the injuries, though one particularly severe wound to the chest appeared to have been made with a different instrument entirely. This detail would prove significant in the weeks to come, though none present that morning could have foreseen the pattern that was already beginning to emerge. The residents of George Yard buildings had awakened to find constables posted at their doorways, notebooks in hand, questions ready. Most claimed to have heard nothing unusual during the night, a response that Aberline found both predictable and troubling. In neighbourhoods where survival often depended on maintaining invisibility, witnesses rarely came forward voluntarily. The walls held secrets as surely as they held the dampness that seeped through every crack and crevice. Mrs. Mary Ann Connolly, who had known Martha by sight, stood in her doorway, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders. Her weathered face bore the marks of too many winters spent in these cramped quarters, too many nights when the cold seemed to penetrate bone itself. She spoke in hushed tones about the woman who'd been known to frequent the public houses along Whitechapel Road, earning her living through means that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. The penny dreadful publications had already begun to sense opportunity in the growing unease that gripped the district. Street corner vendors noticed increased sales of their lurid tales, as if the residents of Whitechapel sought to understand their own fears through the fictional horrors that filled those cheaply printed pages. The stories spoke of supernatural killers and mysterious figures that stalked London streets, but the reality taking shape in George Yard was far more disturbing than any fictional creation. Abelin walked the perimeter of the crime scene, noting details that would later prove crucial to understanding the methods of the killer. The absence of any struggle suggested that Martha had been taken by surprise, or perhaps had known her attacker well enough to lower her guard. The positioning of the body indicated that the assault had taken place precisely where she was found, with no evidence of the body having been moved after death. The September weather had turned unseasonably cold, and frost formed delicate patterns on the windows of the surrounding buildings. Gas lamps flickered with yellow flames that cast dancing shadows across the courtyard, creating an atmosphere that seemed drawn directly from the pages of a Gothic novel. Yet this was no fiction, and the blood that stained the stones beneath their feet served as a stark reminder of the brutality that could emerge from the darkness of human nature. Word of the murder spread through Whitechapel with the efficiency that characterized all gossip in close-knit communities. By mid-morning, groups of women gathered at street corners, their voices low but urgent as they shared what little information had filtered down from the residents of George Yard buildings. The killing had occurred in a location where many of them walked regularly, where they conducted their own business under cover of darkness, and this proximity made the crime feel intensely personal. The local newspapers began to take notice as well, though their initial coverage was relegated to the back pages alongside reports of petty theft and public drunkenness. The editors had not yet recognised that Martha Tabram's death would mark the beginning of something far more significant than a single tragic incident. The machinery of sensational journalism was still warming to the possibilities that lay ahead. Dr. Killeen returned to his surgery on Brick Lane with troubled thoughts weighing heavily upon his mind. In his years of practice in the East End, he had examined countless victims of violence, but the methodical nature of Martha's wounds suggested a killer who possessed both anatomical knowledge and a disturbing level of control. The precision of several cuts indicated familiarity with human anatomy, while the sheer number of wounds spoke to a frenzy that seemed almost contradictory to the surgical accuracy displayed. Inspector Abelin began the process of tracing Martha's final hours, a task that would take him through the public houses and lodging rooms that formed the social infrastructure of Whitechapel's working poor. The 10 Bells public house on Commercial Street had been one of her regular haunts, a place where warmth could be purchased for the price of a gin, and where temporary companionship was always available for those with coin enough to afford it. The proprietor of the 10 Bells, a heavy-set man whose apron bore the permanent stains of years spent serving ale to the district's residents, recalled seeing Martha on the evening of her death. She had appeared in good spirits, he reported, laughing with a soldier who had bought her several drinks throughout the evening. The soldier himself had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the memory of his presence and a growing list of questions about his identity and whereabouts. As the investigation continued, Abelin found himself increasingly aware of the limitations that constrained police work in districts like Whitechapel. The residents' natural distrust of authority, born from years of harsh treatment and indifferent governance, created barriers that made thorough investigation nearly impossible. Witnesses disappeared into the maze of narrow streets and cramped lodging houses, emerging only when necessity forced them back into the light. The press began to take greater interest as days passed without any arrest in Martha's murder. The penny papers that served the working classes started to frame the killing within a narrative of official incompetence and social neglect. Their pages filled with speculation about the killer's identity and motives, theories that ranged from the plausible to the fantastical, each more sensational than the last. Meanwhile, in the morgue beneath St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Martha Tabram's body awaited burial in a pauper's grave, her wounds carefully documented in the precise handwriting that characterized official medical reports. The cold stone tables and antiseptic odors created an atmosphere of clinical detachment that seemed at odds with the violence that had brought her there. Yet even in death, her case continued to generate questions that would prove increasingly difficult to answer. The residents of Whitechapel found themselves caught between fear and fascination as stories of the murder spread beyond their neighbourhood's borders. The same violence that threatened their safety also brought unprecedented attention to their district, attention that carried both opportunities and dangers. Journalists began to frequent the public houses where Martha had spent her final evening, notebooks at the ready, coins available for anyone willing to share their memories or speculations. The autumn nights grew longer and colder as September drew toward its close. Street lamps cast their familiar pools of amber light across cobblestones that seemed to hold secrets in every shadow. The fog that rolled up from the Thames each evening created a dreamlike quality to the familiar streets, transforming ordinary landmarks into mysterious shapes that sparked the imagination and quickened the pulse. Dr. Killeen's medical report would eventually find its way into official files, where it would remain until later events gave it renewed significance. The detailed description of Martha's wounds would provide crucial evidence for establishing patterns and connections that were not yet apparent to those conducting the investigation. The precise nature of the injuries, the apparent medical knowledge displayed by their infliction, and the psychological implications of their number and distribution would all become pieces of a larger puzzle that was still taking shape in the autumn darkness of 1888. As Inspector Aberline concluded his preliminary investigation into Martha Tabram's murder, the case officially remained open but began to fade from immediate attention. Other crimes demanded investigation, other victims required justice, and the limited resources of the Metropolitan Police could not be indefinitely devoted to a single killing, however brutal or mysterious it might have been. Yet, in the narrow streets and crowded tenements of Whitechapel, Martha's death had planted seeds of unease that would soon bloom into something far more substantial. The residents continued to speak of her in hushed tones, and her story began to merge with older tales of violence and mystery that had always haunted London's darker corners. The boundary between reality and the fictional horrors of penny, dreadful publications grew increasingly thin as autumn deepened into the season, when shadows lengthened and fog transformed familiar streets into landscapes of uncertainty and fear. Chapter 6. The Whitechapel Canvas. The morning mist clung to the weathered brick facades of George Yard buildings like a burial shroud, reluctant to surrender its secrets to the pale August dawn. In the narrow courtyard below, the cobblestones bore witness to more than decades of London's industrial grime. They held the crimson testament of Martha Tabram's final moments, a tableau that would forever alter the relationship between fiction and reality in the minds of Victorian London's inhabitants. Inspector Edmund Reed stood at the edge of the scene, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, as he surveyed the carnage that had transformed a common stairwell into something that belonged more properly in the pages of a penny, dreadful than in the mundane reality of Whitechapel's morning routines. The 39 wounds that marked Martha's body spoke of a violence so methodical, so deliberately theatrical, that it seemed almost scripted, as if someone had taken the melodramatic excesses of popular fiction and made them manifest in flesh and blood. The local beat constable had discovered the body at 4:30 in the morning, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the scene as he climbed the stairs of the tenement building. Thomas Barrett, a man whose 20 years of service had inured him to most forms of human misery, had reportedly stepped back from the landing and crossed himself, a gesture that spoke volumes about the nature of what he had encountered in that dim stairwell. Reed had arrived as the first tentative rays of sunlight began to penetrate the perpetual gloom of the East End streets. He found Martha Tabrum's body arranged on the first-floor landing, her dark dress torn and sodden, her face turned toward the grimy window, as if seeking some final glimpse of the world beyond these narrow walls. The inspector's trained eye immediately catalogued the peculiarities of the scene, the deliberate nature of the wounds, the distribution across the victim's torso, the almost ritualistic precision that suggested something far removed from the typical violence that plagued these streets. Dr. Timothy Killeen arrived shortly after dawn, his medical bag clutched in hands that trembled slightly in the morning chill. A man of middle years whose practice served the poorest quarters of London, Killeen had seen his share of violence. But even he would later remark that the injuries inflicted upon Martha Tabrum suggested a mind that had crossed some fundamental boundary between sanity and something altogether darker. As the physician knelt beside the body, his examination revealed wounds that seemed to follow no logical pattern of rage or robbery. The blade had been applied with methodical precision, each puncture carefully placed, each cut deliberate. It was as if the killer had been following some internal script, acting out a drama whose plot existed only in the shadowed recesses of a deeply disturbed imagination. The residents of George Yard buildings gathered in small clusters throughout the morning, their voices forming a low murmur that seemed to blend with the ever-present sounds of the city awakening around them. Mrs. Elizabeth Mahoney, who occupied rooms on the second floor, claimed to have heard nothing unusual during the night, a silence that seemed almost more disturbing than any screams might have been. The absence of any cry for help suggested either that Martha had been overcome too quickly to resist, or that she had known her attacker well enough to approach without alarm. Word of the murder spread through Whitechapel's interconnected network of public houses, lodging rooms and market stalls with the peculiar velocity that characterizes news in close-knit communities. By mid-morning, crowds had begun to gather at both ends of George Yard, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that had made Penny dreadful such profitable ventures for the publishing houses of Fleet Street. The irony was not lost on those who understood the literary appetites of London's working classes. Here was a real horror that surpassed in its genuine terror anything that had ever been serialized in the cheap publications that filled the windows of every street-corner newsagent. The investigation proceeded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized Reed's approach to police work. Witnesses were interviewed, statements recorded, and the physical evidence carefully documented. Yet with each passing hour, it became increasingly clear that this crime possessed qualities that set it apart from the typical murders that occurred in London's poorer districts. The calculated nature of the violence, the theatrical arrangement of the scene, the very fact that Martha's few possessions had been left untouched. All of these details suggested a motivation that transcended the usual categories of passion, profit, or desperate necessity. As the day wore on, Reed found himself returning repeatedly to the thought that this murder seemed almost deliberately crafted to capture public attention. The location, a busy tenement building where discovery was inevitable, the timing, the elaborate nature of the wounds themselves, all seemed designed to create maximum impact upon the collective imagination of London's citizens. It was as if someone had studied the penny dreadfuls carefully and then set about creating a real-life drama that would overshadow any fictional horror. The local newspapers seized upon the story with the enthusiasm that had made sensational journalism one of Victorian London's most profitable enterprises. The Evening News devoted its entire front page to the murder, complete with detailed engravings of George Yard buildings and speculative diagrams showing the likely sequence of events. The language employed by the journalists seemed to borrow directly from the vocabulary of penny dreadful fiction. Terms like fiendish brutality and inhuman savagery appeared with increasing frequency, creating a narrative that blurred the boundaries between factual reporting and sensational entertainment. Martha Tabram herself began to emerge from the investigation as a figure who might have stepped from the pages of urban melodrama. A woman of 39 years, separated from her husband Henry Samuel Tabram, she had been living in common lodging houses and supporting herself through occasional employment and the charity of acquaintances. Her life had been marked by the kind of gradual descent into poverty that characterised so many stories in Victorian London. A respectable beginning followed by a series of small misfortunes that had eventually led her to the precarious existence of Whitechapel's most vulnerable residents. The details of Martha's final evening slowly emerged through the patient work of Reed's investigators. She'd been seen in the company of a soldier in the White Swan public house on Whitechapel High Street, where she'd spent several hours drinking and conversing with various patrons. Later, she had been observed walking toward George Yard in the company of another soldier, their figures disappearing into the maze of narrow streets that surrounded the tenement buildings. The search for these military men led Reed's investigation into the nearby Tower of London barracks, where soldiers from various regiments were questioned about their whereabouts on the night of Martha's death. The interviews revealed the complex social dynamics that existed between the military personnel stationed in London and the civilian population of the East End, relationships that were simultaneously intimate and antagonistic, characterised by both mutual dependence and deep-seated suspicion. Private John Leary of the Coldstream Guards reported having been in the area that evening but claimed no knowledge of Martha Tabram or the events at George Yard buildings. His account was corroborated by several fellow soldiers, yet Reed noted inconsistencies in the testimonies that suggested the military men were protecting someone among their number. The code of silence that prevailed among the soldiers reflected the broader tensions between military discipline and civilian authority that characterised much of late Victorian society. As the investigation continued, patterns began to emerge that would later seem prophetic in their implications. The methodical nature of the violence, the apparent lack of any conventional motive, the theatrical quality of the crime scene, all of these elements would soon become familiar to the residents of Whitechapel, as a series of similar murders began to unfold across the district's fog-shrouded streets. Dr. Killeen's post-mortem examination revealed details that seemed to confirm the suspicions of those who believed they were dealing with an entirely new form of criminal behaviour. The wounds had been inflicted with at least 2 different weapons, a penknife and what appeared to be a bayonet or similar military blade. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, while the pattern of injuries indicated a methodical approach that spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The coroner's inquest, conducted in the 10 Bells public house due to the lack of more suitable facilities in the immediate vicinity, became a focal point for public attention that exceeded anything previously seen in connection with an East End murder. The jury, composed largely of local tradesmen and small business owners, listened with evident fascination as the medical evidence was presented in detail that would have been considered inappropriate for mixed company in more refined social circles. Throughout the proceedings, Reed found himself struggling with the growing sense that this case represented something fundamentally different from the usual run of criminal investigations. The attention it had attracted, the nature of the evidence, the very atmosphere that seemed to surround the entire affair, all suggested that the murder of Martha Tabram had opened a door to something that would prove far more significant than anyone yet realised. The verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown surprised no one, yet it seemed inadequate to address the broader implications of what had occurred in George Yard buildings. As the formal proceedings concluded, and the crowds began to disperse into the gathering dusk of another London evening, many residents of Whitechapel found themselves looking over their shoulders as they made their way through streets that had suddenly become charged with new possibilities for terror. The penny dreadfuls that had long provided vicarious thrills for London's working classes began to seem almost quaint in comparison to the reality that had manifested itself in their own neighbourhood. The fictional horrors of Gothic romance and supernatural melodrama paled beside the genuine menace that now seemed to lurk in every shadowed doorway and fog-shrouded alley of the East End. As autumn approached and the days grew shorter, the residents of Whitechapel would discover that Martha Tabrum's murder had been merely the opening chapter in a story that would transform their district into the most notorious address in London, a place where the boundary between penny, dreadful fiction and brutal reality would dissolve entirely in a series of crimes that would capture the imagination of the entire world. Chapter 7. The Autumn of Shadows. The summer of 1888 had drawn to its close with an oppressive weight that seemed to settle over London like a burial shroud. The heat that had baked the cobblestones and filled the tenements with stifling air gave way to something far more ominous, a creeping chill that whispered through the narrow alleys of Whitechapel with fingers of frost and premonition. The penny dreadfuls that had entertained the masses with their tales of Gothic horror suddenly seemed pale and inadequate against the gathering darkness that crept through the streets of the East End. Martha Tabrum moved through these streets with the weary resignation of a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of survival in Victorian London's most desperate quarter. At 39 years of age, she carried herself with the particular exhaustion that marked those who had fallen through the cracks of society's carefully constructed facade. Her face, once perhaps pretty in the manner of the working-class girls who caught the eye of young men in better times, now bore the lines and shadows that spoke of harder choices and crueler circumstances. The August night wrapped around her like a damp cloth as she made her way through the maze of courts and alleys that formed the geography of her diminished world. George Yard buildings rose before her, a testament to the kind of architecture that housed London's forgotten souls. Narrow staircases that echoed with footsteps both hurried and hesitant, doorways that opened onto rooms where privacy was a luxury few could afford, and walls thin enough that secrets became common knowledge whether their owners wished it or not. Above the rooftops, the sky held that peculiar quality of late summer evenings in London, when the sun had long since disappeared behind the endless rows of chimneys and the gaslight had not yet claimed full dominion over the darkness. In this liminal hour, when day reluctantly surrendered to night, the city took on an aspect that seemed to blur the boundaries between the rational world of commerce and industry and something far older and more mysterious. The penny dreadfuls that filled the minds of London's working classes had long trafficked in tales that played upon these very shadows, published on cheap paper and sold for prices that even the poorest could occasionally afford. These serialized stories wove narratives of supernatural terror and Gothic romance that provided escape from the grinding realities of industrial life. Stories of vampires and werewolves, of haunted castles and mysterious monks, of beautiful maidens pursued by dark forces through moonlit graveyards. All of these formed the common currency of popular entertainment in an age that was rapidly transforming from ancient superstition to modern rationality. Yet as Martha Tabrum paused at the entrance to the stairwell of George Yard buildings, the fictional horrors of the penny dreadfuls seemed suddenly inadequate to capture the sense of dread that permeated the very air of Whitechapel. There was something stirring in the darkness of these streets that belonged neither to the realm of Gothic fantasy nor to the comfortable predictability of everyday crime and misfortune. Something was awakening that would prove far more terrifying than any creation of the imagination. The social fabric of the East End had long been strained to its breaking point. Waves of immigration, industrial displacement, and economic upheaval had created a population of the desperate and dispossessed who lived their lives in the margins of Victorian society. Women like Martha found themselves caught in circumstances that offered few choices and fewer protections. The workhouses, with their brutal regimens and deliberate humiliations, often seemed worse than the streets. Domestic service, when available, paid wages that could barely sustain life and offered no security against illness or age. Marriage, for those who had fallen too far from respectability, became increasingly unlikely. In such circumstances, The line between survival and degradation became increasingly thin. The streets themselves became both workplace and home for those who had exhausted other options. Each night brought its own negotiations with danger, its own calculations of risk against necessity. The gaslight that flickered at irregular intervals through the narrow passages provided islands of relative safety, but between these pools of amber illumination lay stretches of darkness that could conceal anything. Martha had learned to read these streets with the skill of someone whose life depended upon such knowledge. She knew which footsteps behind her represented mere coincidence, and which suggested something more deliberate. She understood the subtle signs that marked the difference between a potential customer and a potential threat. She had developed the particular alertness that comes to those who must constantly assess their environment for signs of danger, while simultaneously maintaining the appearance of availability that her circumstances required. The fog that began to creep up from the Thames carried with it the mingled scents of the river, coal smoke and industrial waste, the brackish smell of tidal waters, and something else that seemed to speak of older mysteries. London's fog had become legendary, a physical manifestation of the city's transformation from a medieval town into the heart of an industrial empire. But on this particular evening, the mist that wound through the streets seemed to carry more than moisture and smoke. It brought with it a sense of anticipation, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. In the rooms and lodging houses around George Yard, other lives were playing out their own dramas of survival and desperation. Women who had once known better circumstances now faced each day with the grim determination of those who understand that tomorrow is never guaranteed. Men who'd been displaced from traditional trades by the relentless advance of machinery sought whatever work they could find, often competing with waves of immigrants who were willing to accept even lower wages for the chance to establish themselves in the great city. The penny dreadfuls that circulated among these populations offered a particular kind of comfort. In their pages, evil was clearly defined and ultimately defeated. Heroes might face terrible trials, but virtue was eventually rewarded and wickedness punished. The supernatural forces that menaced their protagonists operated according to rules that could be understood and ultimately overcome. Even the most terrifying vampires could be defeated by garlic and holy water, the most fearsome werewolves subdued by silver bullets. But the evil that was beginning to stalk the streets of Whitechapel would prove immune to such simple remedies. It would emerge not from the realm of supernatural fantasy, but from the twisted depths of human psychology, given form and focus by the particular pressures and opportunities of urban life in the late Victorian age. The very rationality that had supposedly banished the old superstitions would prove inadequate to comprehend or contain the horror that was about to unfold. Martha made her way up the stairs of George Yard buildings, each step echoing in the narrow stairwell with a sound that seemed to carry further than it should. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that it was about to become part of a story that would echo through history. The other residents, behind their thin doors, went about their evening routines unaware that they were living through the opening movements of a symphony of terror that would soon fill the headlines of every newspaper in London. The relationship between the penny dreadfuls and the coming reality would prove more complex than anyone could have imagined. The fictional horrors that had entertained readers with their gothic excess had, in some strange way, prepared the public imagination for the possibility of genuine monster walking among them. When the murders began in earnest, the language and imagery that people reached for to comprehend them would be drawn directly from the vocabulary of supernatural terror that the cheap publications had made familiar. As Martha reached her destination on that August evening, the city around her continued its ancient rhythms. Gas lamps flickered to life at their appointed times. Police constables walked their beats with the measured tread of men following routes made familiar by repetition. In the public houses, working men gathered over pints of ale to discuss the day's events and tomorrow's prospects. In the more respectable districts, families gathered for evening meals and domestic conversations, that took for granted a security and stability that would soon seem far more fragile than anyone suspected. The fog continued to thicken as the night deepened, wrapping the East End in a shroud that seemed to muffle sound and blur the boundaries between familiar and strange. In this atmosphere, where the ordinary landmarks became uncertain and the familiar streets took on an aspect of the unknown, the stage was being set for events that would transform Whitechapel from merely another impoverished district into a name that would be spoken with a shiver of recognition for generations to come. The penny dreadfuls had taught their readers to expect their monsters to announce themselves with dramatic flourishes, thunder and lightning, supernatural manifestations, obvious signs of otherworldly presence. But the real horror that was about to emerge would prove far more subtle and therefore far more terrifying. It would walk among the ordinary people of London wearing the face of humanity itself, indistinguishable from any other figure in the crowd, until the moment it chose to reveal its true nature. Martha Tabram could not have known, as she navigated the darkened streets of Whitechapel on that August evening, that she was walking into a story that would blur the line between penny dreadful fiction and documented history. The fog that swirled around her carried the scent of approaching autumn and the whisper of changes that would soon transform her world into something far stranger and more terrible than any Gothic romance had ever dared to imagine. Chapter 8. The Autumn of Shadows. The penny press had grown fat on sensation throughout the long summer of 1888, their headlines screaming of mysterious deaths and vanished souls across the sprawling darkness of London's East End. Yet as September's chill crept through the narrow streets and alleyways of Whitechapel, even the most imaginative scribblers found themselves surpassed by reality's cruel artistry. The fictional horrors that had delighted readers for decades seemed pale and contrived against the backdrop of genuine terror that now stalked the gaslit thoroughfares where the city's forgotten made their desperate living. Martha Tabram's body had been discovered on the 2nd day of August, pierced by 39 wounds that spoke of frenzied violence beyond the comprehension of even the most hardened constables. The George Yard buildings where she'd drawn her final breath cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and those shadows seemed to deepen as the weeks passed. The residents spoke in hushed tones of footsteps echoing through the corridors at impossible hours, of whispered conversations that ceased the moment one approached their source. Inspector Frederick Aberline moved through these streets with the measured pace of a man who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for darkness. His coat collar turned against the autumn wind, he studied the scene where Martha had fallen with the methodical attention that had earned him his reputation among the Metropolitan Police. The blood had long since been scrubbed away, yet something lingered in the very stones beneath his feet, a presence that seemed to whisper of horrors yet to come. The penny dreadfuls had trained the public mind to expect their monsters wrapped in Gothic romance, creatures of supernatural origin who stalk their victims through moonlit graveyards and ancient castles. But this predator moved through the squalid reality of London's industrial heart, where the smoke from countless chimneys mixed with the Thames's perpetual fog to create a shroud that seemed designed to conceal the worst impulses of human nature. The gaslights flickered uncertainly against this murk, casting pools of amber illumination that only served to make the surrounding darkness more profound. Polly Nichols walked these same streets as August surrendered to September, her footsteps echoing off the brick walls of the lodging houses where she had spent her final coins on a bed for the night. The Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary loomed over the district like a monument to despair, its windows glowing with the pale light of gas flames that burned through the night. Here gathered London's most desperate souls, those who had fallen through the cracks of Victoria's great empire to find themselves trapped in a world that existed parallel to, but separate from the prosperity celebrated in the illustrated newspapers. The autumn brought with it a peculiar quality to the fog that rolled in from the river each evening. Old residents claimed they had never seen its like, the way it seemed to cling to the narrow passages between buildings and refused to lift even when the morning sun burned bright above the city's chimneys. Children hurried past certain alleyways without knowing why, their instincts alert to dangers their conscious minds could not yet comprehend. Shopkeepers found themselves closing their establishments earlier than usual, drawn by an inexplicable urge to retreat behind locked doors as darkness fell. The penny dreadful publishers sensed the changing mood of their readership and adjusted their tales accordingly. Stories of urban monsters began to appear alongside the traditional Gothic fantasies, creatures who hunted not in crumbling castles, but in the very streets where their readers walked each day. The serialized adventures of Spring-Hill Jack gained renewed popularity, his supernatural leaps across London's rooftops seeming almost plausible in a city where reality had begun to outpace imagination. Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn conducted his examination of Martha Tabram's remains in the mortuary's cold chamber, the gaslight casting harsh shadows across his weathered features. A man of science trained in the rational methods of medical investigation, he found himself confronted with wounds that defied easy explanation. The pattern of the injuries suggested a mind consumed by rage so complete that it had transcended human understanding, yet the precision of certain cuts spoke of anatomical knowledge that few possessed. The newspapers seized upon these details with the fervour of merchants who had discovered gold in the London clay. Yet even their most sensational accounts failed to capture the true horror of what had occurred in George Yard buildings. Words seemed inadequate to convey the violation of human dignity that had taken place in those narrow confines, the transformation of a living woman into something that existed purely as a message written in blood and terror. As September advanced, the residents of Whitechapel began to develop new rituals of survival. Women travelled in groups when darkness fell, their voices creating a protective chorus against the silence that seemed to pool in doorways and beneath the arches of railway bridges. The public houses extended their hours of operation, becoming informal sanctuaries where the community gathered to share rumours and reassurance in equal measure. Landlords found their tenants reluctant to venture out alone, willing to pay extra for shared accommodations rather than face the streets in solitude. The penny dreadful writers discovered that their most fantastic creations paled beside the reality unfolding in the East End. Vampires and werewolves seemed almost comforting compared to the possibility of a human predator who moved among them without supernatural powers, relying instead on cunning and the protective darkness of London's industrial landscape. The city's fog, once merely an inconvenience, had transformed into something that felt deliberately malevolent, as if the very atmosphere conspired to conceal the hunter's movements. Police Constable John Neal walked his beat through the streets of Bucks Row with the measured tread of a man who understood that vigilance had become a matter of life and death for those in his charge. The rhythm of his footsteps on the cobblestones provided a steady counterpoint to the distant sounds of the city, the clatter of late omnibuses, the whistle of trains carrying passengers to safer districts, the occasional cry of a night watchman calling the hour. The architectural landscape of Whitechapel itself seemed to shift in response to the growing fear. Alleyways that had once served as convenient shortcuts between major thoroughfares now appeared as potential traps, their narrow confines offering concealment to anyone who might wish to remain unseen. The railway arches that provided shelter for the homeless became places to be avoided, their shadows too deep and their acoustics too confusing for safety. In the lodging houses where the district's transient population sought nightly refuge, conversations took on new patterns as September wore on. The casual exchanges about work and weather gave way to urgent discussions of safety and survival. Women shared information about which streets to avoid and which public houses remained open latest. Men spoke in lowered voices about forming protective groups, though few had the resources or organisation necessary to make such plans reality. The penny dreadfuls had always drawn their power from the delicious terror of fictional danger, allowing readers to experience fear from the safety of their own homes. But now the streets of London seemed to pulse, with a menace that no amount of literary artifice could match. The serialized horrors that had once provided an escape from daily drudgery now seemed almost quaint compared to the genuine nightmare unfolding in the gaslit darkness beyond every reader's door. Dr. Llewellyn's reports made their way through the channels of official London, each detail adding weight to a growing realization that something unprecedented had entered the city's bloodstream. The methodical nature of the violence suggested a mind that had moved beyond spontaneous rage into territory that few wished to contemplate. The medical evidence spoke of knowledge and preparation, of someone who had studied the human form with purposes that no legitimate practitioner would entertain. As the final days of September approached, the fog seemed to thicken with anticipation. The penny dreadfuls continued their weekly publications, but their editors noticed a subtle change in their readership's appetite. The old Gothic fantasies no longer satisfied audiences who had tasted genuine fear. Reality had become the most compelling horror story of all, and its next chapter waited in the shadows of Whitechapel's narrow streets, where the gaslight flickered against a darkness that seemed to possess a will of its own. Chapter 9. The Autumn of Endless Night. The autumn of 1888 settled over London like a burial shroud, heavy with fog and weighted with the scent of coal smoke that drifted from 10,000 chimneys into the grey October sky. In the narrow streets of Whitechapel, the gaslight struggled against the perpetual twilight that seemed to have claimed the district as its own domain. The penny dreadfuls that had once entertained the masses with tales of fictional terror now lay forgotten in shop windows, their lurid covers pale beside the reality that stalked the cobblestones with methodical precision. Martha Tabram's blood had long since washed from the stones of George Yard, but the memory lingered in the tenements like incense in an abandoned chapel. The residents of the buildings moved through their daily routines with the careful steps of those who understood that death had taken up residence among them. Children no longer played in the courtyards after sunset, and women clutched their shawls closer as they hurried through the narrow passages that connected one shadow to another. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline stood at his window overlooking Commercial Street, watching the ebb and flow of humanity below. The gaslight cast amber pools along the pavement, creating islands of visibility in an ocean of darkness that seemed to press against the glass like something alive. His reflection stared back at him from the window, the face of a man who had seen too much in his years with the Metropolitan Police, yet found himself unprepared for the particular horror that had settled over his jurisdiction like fog rolling up from the Thames. The autumn brought with it a steady parade of witnesses, each bearing fragments of a puzzle that refused to resolve into any recognizable pattern. Mrs. Elizabeth Long had seen a woman speaking with a man near the 10 Bells public house in the early hours of September the 8th. The description she provided matched dozens of men who might be found in Whitechapel at any given moment, respectably dressed, of average height, wearing the dark clothing that marked him as neither wealthy nor destitute. Her words echoed in the inspector's mind as he watched the street below, where similar figures moved through the gaslight like actors in a play performed for an audience of shadows. The newspapers had seized upon the murders with the enthusiasm of merchants discovering gold in their cellars. The headlines grew larger with each edition, the speculation more elaborate, the theories more fantastic. Yet beneath the sensational coverage lay a truth that Aberline found more disturbing than any penny dreadful fiction. The killer moved through Whitechapel with the confidence of someone who understood its rhythms, its hiding places, its particular geography of desperation and hope. Annie Chapman had been discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street on the morning of September the 8th, her body positioned with the same terrible precision that had marked Martha Tabram's murder. The court physician who examined her remains spoke in clinical terms that could not disguise the methodical nature of the violence. Each cut had been made with purpose, each wound calculated to achieve a specific effect. The killer possessed knowledge of anatomy that suggested education, yet moved through the poorest district of London with the familiarity of a native. The fog that perpetually shrouded the district seemed to thicken as autumn deepened, creating a landscape where sound travelled strangely and distances became uncertain. Footsteps echoed from unseen sources, and voices drifted through the mist like messages from another world. The residents of Whitechapel adapted to this altered reality with the resilience of those who had long since learned to expect little comfort from life. They developed new patterns of movement, new habits of caution, new ways of reading the darkness that surrounded them. In the lodging houses that lined Dorset Street and Thrall Street, conversations turned inevitably to the murders. The theories proposed by the inhabitants ranged from the practical to the fantastical, yet all shared a common understanding that whatever stalked their streets possessed an intelligence that made it more dangerous than mere madness. The killer understood timing, location, the habits of the police constables who walked their beats with the regularity of clockwork. This knowledge suggested careful observation, patient study, the methodical approach of someone who viewed the district as a chessboard, where every move had been calculated in advance. Elizabeth Stride's murder on September the 30th had introduced a new element of uncertainty into the pattern. Found in Dutfield's yard beside the International Working Men's Club, her body bore fewer wounds than the previous victims, leading some to speculate that the killer had been interrupted before completing his work. The possibility that he might have been forced to abandon his plans mid-attack suggested a vulnerability that offered both hope and additional terror. If he could be interrupted, he was human. If he continued to kill, despite the risk of discovery, his compulsion was stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. Less than an hour after Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, her remains bearing the familiar signs of the killer's particular methodology. The timing suggested either incredible boldness or a compulsion so strong that it overrode all considerations of safety. The two murders on a single night transformed the killer from a methodical predator into something approaching a force of nature, as unpredictable as lightning and equally devastating. The autumn rain fell with unusual persistence that October, turning the unpaved streets into rivers of mud that reflected the gaslight in patterns that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. The water carried with it the accumulated grime of the city, the ash from countless chimneys, the detritus of daily life that collected in the gutters and pooled in the low places where shadows gathered during the day. Walking through Whitechapel in the rain became an exercise in navigation between puddles that might conceal anything from a lost coin to evidence of the killer's presence. The penny dreadful publishers, whose sensational stories had once seemed like the height of fictional horror, found themselves struggling to compete with reality. The murders possessed a quality that transcended mere violence, a precision and purpose that suggested narratives more complex than their formulaic tales of ghosts and ghouls. Some enterprising writers attempted to capitalize on the public fascination by creating stories inspired by the murders, but their efforts felt hollow beside the genuine terror that stalked the streets of Whitechapel with each passing night. Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon who examined the victims, worked by gaslight and candle flame in rooms that seemed to absorb shadow like cloth absorbs water. His reports, written in the careful handwriting of a man trained in precision, documented wounds that spoke of knowledge acquired through study and practice. The killer understood the structure of the human body with the familiarity of a medical student, yet applied this knowledge with purposes that no physician would recognize as healing. The residents of Whitechapel developed their own theories about the killer's identity and methods, theories that spread through the district like smoke through a crowded room. Some believed he was a gentleman who descended into the East End like a tourist visiting foreign lands, using his superior knowledge and resources to prey upon those who lacked the protection of wealth or social position. Others insisted he must be a local man, someone who understood the district's particular rhythms and could move through its streets without attracting attention. The gaslight that illuminated Commercial Street and Dorset Street created pools of visibility separated by stretches of darkness that seemed to pulse with their own life. Walking from one lamp to another required a brief journey through shadow that felt longer than the actual distance covered. In these intervals of darkness, the imagination supplied possibilities that daylight would have dismissed as fantasy. The killer might be anyone, might be anywhere, might be watching from any of the countless windows that overlook the streets where his victims had walked their final steps. Queen Victoria's empire stretched across continents and encompassed populations that numbered in the hundreds of millions, yet the attention of the civilized world focused increasingly on a few square miles of London's East End, where autumn fog mixed with coal smoke to create a permanent twilight. The murders had transformed Whitechapel from an obscure district known mainly to social reformers and police constables into a symbol of something darker than poverty or neglect. Here, civilization confronted its own capacity for horror, and the encounter revealed possibilities that no amount of progress or enlightenment could entirely eliminate. The October nights grew longer as autumn deepened toward winter, and with the lengthening darkness came a sense that time itself had been altered by the murders. The normal rhythm of day and night seemed suspended, replaced by a permanent state of anticipation that made sleep difficult and waking hours feel like a vigil. The killer had not merely taken lives, he had transformed the very nature of time in Whitechapel, creating a temporal landscape where past and future collapsed into an eternal present moment of waiting for the next revelation of horror. As October drew toward its close, the fog seemed to settle more permanently over the district, creating a microclimate of perpetual dusk that made navigation by landmark increasingly difficult. The familiar buildings appeared and disappeared in the shifting mist like ships glimpsed through ocean spray. In this altered geography, distances became uncertain and directions unreliable. The killer moved through this transformed landscape with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate by senses other than sight, while his potential victims struggled to maintain their bearings in a world where every street corner might lead to an encounter with terror. The autumn of 1888 would be remembered not for its weather or its harvests, but for the way it had revealed the proximity of horror to ordinary life. In the narrow streets of Whitechapel, the boundary between the civilized world and something far more primitive had proven to be as thin as morning frost, as easily crossed as the distance between one gaslight and the next. The killer continued his work with the patience of someone who understood that time was on his side, that the darkness would always return, and that the fog would always provide cover for those who move through London's night with purposes too terrible to name. The chapter of autumn murders was drawing toward its close, but the story they told was far from finished. In the lodging houses and public houses of Whitechapel, conversations continued late into each night. Voices whispering theories and possibilities that would have seemed impossible just months before. The penny dreadfuls lay forgotten, their fictional horrors rendered quaint by the reality that walked among the living with such methodical persistence that it had begun to seem like a natural force, as inevitable as the turning of seasons and the rising of fog from the Thames. Chapter 10. The Final Page. The winter of 1889 descended upon London like a shroud drawn across the city's weary shoulders. In the narrow confines of Dorset Street, where the gaslights cast their amber pools against the perpetual fog, the residents of the lodging houses pulled their threadbare coats tighter and spoke in whispers of the terror that had stalked their streets. The penny dreadfuls that had once provided cheap entertainment now lay abandoned on tavern tables, their fictional horrors paling beside the brutal reality that had unfolded in the shadows of Whitechapel. Mary Jane Kelly's room in Miller's Court had been sealed with boards and nails, the landlord unwilling to let the chamber where such unspeakable acts had occurred. The November frost had settled into the crevices of the cobblestones, and children no longer played in the courtyard where her cries had echoed on that terrible night. The other residents moved past the boarded window with averted eyes, crossing themselves and muttering prayers learned in childhood Sunday schools, now transformed into desperate incantations against an evil that seemed to permeate the very air they breathed. Inspector Frederick Aberline stood in the grey dawn light outside the 10 Bells public house, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. The investigation that had consumed his waking hours for months had reached an impasse as solid and immovable as the Tower of London itself. Files lay stacked upon his desk like accusations, filled with witness statements that contradicted one another, medical reports that raised more questions than they answered, and letters from citizens claiming knowledge they did not possess. The press had grown restless, their headlines demanding answers that seemed to dissolve like morning mist whenever he reached for them. The streets themselves bore witness to the change that had settled over the district. Where once the unfortunate women of Whitechapel had walked alone through the narrow passages, now they moved in pairs or small groups, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows for signs of danger. The public houses closed their doors earlier, and even the most hardened residents of the lodging houses barricaded their rooms with whatever furniture they could muster. The very architecture of the neighbourhood seemed to have absorbed the fear, with doorways that had once provided shelter now appearing as potential traps, and alleyways that had served as shortcuts becoming corridors of dread. The penny press had exhausted its vocabulary of sensation in describing the horrors that had unfolded. Editors who had once competed to publish the most lurid accounts now found themselves struggling to convey the magnitude of what had occurred without descending into exploitative sensationalism. The public appetite for Gothic fiction had been sated by reality, and the sales of penny dreadfuls declined as readers discovered that truth could be more terrifying than any manufactured nightmare. Publishers who had built their fortunes on tales of fictional monsters now faced the uncomfortable realization that genuine evil required no embellishment to chill the blood. Dr. Thomas Bond completed his final report as the December snow began to fall outside the windows of the London hospital mortuary. His careful handwriting filled page after page with clinical observations and medical terminology that seemed inadequate to capture the horror he had witnessed. The bodies he had examined told a story of methodical brutality that haunted his professional detachment. Each wound had been inflicted with surgical precision, suggesting knowledge of human anatomy that went beyond the casual violence of street crime. The killer had worked in darkness, yet displayed a familiarity with his victims that spoke to careful observation and planning. The churches of Whitechapel found their pews filled with faces that had not appeared for Sunday services in years. Reverend Samuel Barnett of St. Jude's Church delivered sermons to congregations swollen with fear, his words offering comfort to souls that had witnessed the darkest capabilities of human nature. The collection plates overflowed with pennies and halfpennies from those who had little to spare, offerings made not from charity, but from desperate hope that divine intervention might protect them from the evil that walked their streets. The hymns that rose from these gatherings carried a fervour born of genuine terror, voices joining together in praise that doubled as prayer for deliverance. The investigation files grew thicker with each passing week, filled with reports that led nowhere and testimonies that crumbled under scrutiny. Chief Inspector Henry Moore reviewed the evidence with the methodical patience of a scholar, examining ancient manuscripts, searching for patterns and connections that might reveal the identity of their quarry. The forensic techniques available to the Metropolitan Police seemed primitive in the face of such calculated savagery. Fingerprinting remained a nascent science, and criminal investigation relied heavily upon witness identification and circumstantial evidence, both of which had proven frustratingly elusive in this case. The social reformers who had long campaigned for improvements to the living conditions in Whitechapel found their voices amplified by the tragedy that had befallen the district. The murders had drawn attention to the grinding poverty and moral degradation that characterised life in the East End, transforming abstract social problems into visceral concerns that demanded immediate action. Philanthropists who had previously ignored the plight of the unfortunate women now contributed generously to funds established for their protection, though their charity came tinged with the guilty recognition that it had taken such horror to motivate their compassion. As winter deepened, the patrols that had been established in response to the murders became routine fixtures in the nightly landscape of Whitechapel. Constables walked their beats with lanterns held high, their footsteps echoing against the brick walls of the tenements in rhythmic cadences that provided some measure of comfort to those huddled behind locked doors. The vigilance committee that had formed among the residents continued to organise watch groups, though their initial enthusiasm had been tempered by the realisation that their quarry possessed skills that made detection nearly impossible. The public houses that had once served as refuges for the working poor now functioned as informal intelligence centres where rumours and speculation were exchanged along with pints of ale. Conversations that had once centred on labour disputes and family gossip now revolved around theories about the killer's identity and debates about the adequacy of police protection. The landlords of these establishments found themselves in the unusual position of community leaders, their premises serving as meeting places where residents could share information and derive comfort from collective vigilance. The penny dreadful publishers attempted to capitalise on the public fascination with the murders by producing fictional accounts that claimed to reveal the true identity of the killer. These hastily written narratives bore sensational titles and promised shocking revelations, but readers who had followed the actual investigation found these manufactured stories pale and unconvincing compared to the genuine mystery that remained unsolved. The boundary between fiction and reality had been irrevocably altered, leaving audiences hungry for truth rather than fabricated sensationalism. In the offices of Scotland Yard, senior officials privately acknowledged that the investigation had reached an effective conclusion without achieving its primary objective. The files would remain open, and any new evidence would be pursued with appropriate diligence. But the practical reality was that the trail had grown cold. The killer had either ceased his activities, moved to a different location, or perhaps met with some fate that prevented continuation of his crimes. The investigation had consumed enormous resources and generated thousands of pages of documentation, yet the central question remained unanswered. The women who had survived the terror began the slow process of rebuilding their lives within the changed landscape of Whitechapel. Some secured passage to other parts of London or even to distant cities, seeking fresh starts in places untainted by the memories of autumn 1888. Others remained, bound by poverty or family obligations to the district that had become synonymous with horror. These survivors carried within their memories the faces of friends who had not lived to see the spring, and their testimonies would become part of the historical record that preserved the human cost of the murders. The medical professionals who had examined the victims and participated in the investigation found their perspectives on criminal violence permanently altered by what they had witnessed. The methodical nature of the attacks had revealed possibilities for human cruelty that challenged their understanding of mental illness and criminal behaviour. Their reports and observations would influence the development of criminal psychology for generations. Though the immediate impact was a profound sense of unease about the darkness that could lurk within seemingly ordinary individuals. As spring returned to London in 1889, the acute terror that had gripped Whitechapel gradually subsided into a chronic wariness that would characterise the district for years to come. The murders had become part of the neighbourhood's identity, woven into its folklore and memory in ways that would outlast the physical evidence of the crimes themselves. Children who had been born after the terror ended would grow up hearing whispered stories of the autumn when evil had walked among them, and these tales would shape their understanding of their community's history. The files containing the investigation records were eventually transferred to storage facilities, where they would await future generations of scholars and criminologists. The physical evidence was catalogued and preserved according to the procedures of the time, though much would be lost to fire, flood, and the simple passage of decades. The photographs taken at the crime scenes were sealed away, deemed too disturbing for public viewing, yet preserved as testimony to the reality of what had occurred in those narrow streets and cramped rooms. The legacy of the penny, dreadful murders extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of the victims and their families. The case had exposed the limitations of Victorian criminal investigation techniques and had prompted discussions about the need for improved methods of identifying and apprehending dangerous criminals. The murders had also highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalised members and had contributed to broader conversations about social reform and the responsibilities of government to protect all citizens regardless of their station in life. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the fog rolled in from the Thames and settled over the sleeping city, the streets of Whitechapel returned to a semblance of their former character. The milk carts made their rounds, their wheels rattling over the cobblestones in familiar rhythms. The early workers emerged from the lodging houses to begin another day of labour, their footsteps joining the ancient symphony of urban life that had resumed its course despite the interruption of terror. The candle burned low in the window of the last public house to close its doors. The proprietor counted his receipts by the failing light, his thoughts turning to the customers who would no longer darken his threshold. The chamber fell silent as he extinguished the flame, leaving only the distant sound of the Thames lapping against its banks, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark.